for sharing that. Hey, welcome. My name is Andrew, and I am the pastor here at Thrive LA Church. It's great to celebrate Easter Sunday with you. Easter celebrates that about 2 millennia ago, as we just read, that Jesus, on a Thursday, he ate a holiday meal with his friends and family. He endured an overnight illegal trial on a Friday. He died, spent Saturday, the Sabbath, in a tomb. And on Sunday, when they came to look for him and to tend to his body in the tomb, he was gone. He had raised from the dead. And this event shapes, more than any other event, everything about the Christian worldview. And it has had a profound, life-changing, earth-shattering, history-altering effect on everything we think and see and know about the world that we live in. And I got to tell you, Easter is pretty big. Now, and here's what I mean by that. It's much bigger than even I thought. There's about 2 billion professing Christians in the world. That's a lot of people. I've never counted that high. Maybe as a kid you try to count to 1,000 or something. One time I think I was on a bus ride for school and I counted to 10,000. I've never counted to 2 billion. That's a lot of people. A lot of people. There's a lot of people on this earth. There's 2 billion people, but the effects of Christianity are crazy. So much so that I looked things up because I only know how we celebrated Easter in my house growing up. I didn't really grow up going to church so much, but we had the bunnies and the eggs and all of that. You guys had some of that, the Cadbury eggs, that now I eat them and it's too much, I get sick. But here's what they do around the world. In the UK, people celebrate by something called egg jarping. Anyone ever heard of that? Where you take hard-boiled eggs and you smash them into each other, and if your egg is the stronger egg and it doesn't crack, you win. We need to start that tradition here. In Norway, they celebrate Easter by reading crime and mystery novels. I looked this up because that didn't make sense to me. And apparently, back in the day, somebody was trying to promote their book, and they took out an ad in the newspaper, and everybody thought it was such a realistic newspaper ad, they thought that there was an unsolved crime in the community, and it hoodwinked the whole community, and everyone thought it was funny. And so now in Norway, every year, they read crime and mystery novels for Easter, I'm told. In Florence, I really like this one. If you've ever been, in Italy, they have these big, grand cathedrals. And there's this one cathedral called the Duomo, which is just this gorgeous, beautiful building. Well, apparently, in the streets leading up to the Duomo, they build this big, giant, ornate cart, and they stuff it with fireworks. And they lead the cart all the way into the front of this, historical landmark of a beautiful building, and they light the cart on fire and blow it up. That is so epic. In Bermuda, they fly kites because apparently that was how they would teach their children about the cross. I guess kites used to look like a wooden cross, and so they fly kites to celebrate Easter. In Sweden, there's a tradition where little girls dress up like witches and go door to door. Now it sounds a lot like Halloween, but they go door to door handing out paintings in exchange for sweets. I want to know when people are coming to my door to give me paintings. That's really cool. In Sweden, in southern France, there's a tradition in this little city that's associated with Napoleon where they make an omelet with 4,500 eggs in it.
4,500?
Yes. Yes. Astounded crowd. 4,500. In Poland, there's some tradition related to some king in 1000 AD who got baptized. So in Poland, in the streets on Easter, they dump buckets of water on you, apparently. I gotta imagine it's cold this time of year, but that's what they do. And in America, we spend $16 billion buying clothes and candy. The average family spends $140. I must admit that I did buy some new socks for Easter. So those were about $8. My son and I are wearing matching socks. You can't even see them, but he and I, we know in the nursery. I was gonna wear a t-shirt. I think my wife overruled me, but we spend money on clothes and things like that for Easter's. And it's not just the parties. In Ethiopia, there's a tradition where people fast, meaning they don't eat, I think they eat in just the evenings for 55 days leading up to Easter. So in religious devotion, instead of eating breakfast or lunch, they pray for 55 days in a row leading up to Easter. In Russia, there's traditions where Christians give money, food, and clothes to the poor. In Jerusalem, there are traditions where you can actually walk the path that Jesus walked from trial to trial the night before his death. And I myself have walked this path before, literally the steps. And so people gather each year to walk this path that Jesus walked the night before he died in remembrance of him in solemnity. And even today, and you may be able to relate to this one, 50% of Americans will be in church today or are planning to be in church, even though on a typical Sunday only about 16% of Americans are in church. And so we're all in the spirit of the holiday, and something has happened. Some movement has happened in our world that is undeniable. And so we have to ask, what is all the fuss about? What was so monumental? What was so earth-shattering? What was so life-changing? How could something that started from a poor child of an unwed mother in a small town halfway across the globe 2,000 years ago, how could this, his life, have resulted in all that we see and hear today? And so what I would like to do is I would like to spend our next few moments together just exploring a few reasons, 5 reasons, why you and I, why we should stop to consider this event. Why we have to slow down and go, okay, maybe there's something here that I need to take note of, that needs to register in my mind and my heart. And what is this? Why is this such a big deal that we read about this guy who died, was buried, and claims to have risen from the grave? And so I'm going to give you a few reasons that perhaps we should consider this in further depth. And here's the first one, is that this event was predicted in advance. So we were just reading a little bit in Luke 24. We read the whole story to kind of set the scene. I'm going to zoom in on part of it. In the early morning, the women go to the tomb. And it says, and as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, these men they saw said to them, Luke 24, verse 5, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen." And he said, "Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and on the 3rd day rise?" And they remembered his words. And returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and all the rest. You see, part of the reason that this was such an epic event, obviously aside from the claim that somebody rose from the dead, is that there's some legitimacy to it because it was something predicted long in advance. It was predicted by Jesus himself, and many times with his followers in front of large crowds and small crowds and intimate settings and big settings, and numerous times over and over again, he said that he would die and rise from the grave. In fact, one time, he was standing in the temple in Jerusalem, the center of religious devotion in the known world at that time to that community. He stood there in front of everybody, and he looked at the temple, this huge part of society. It'd be like standing in front of the White House, and he said, "I'm going to tear this building down, but in 3 days I'm going to build it up." And everyone was like, "What's he talking about?" And what they found out was he was talking about that he would die in 3 days, rise again. He had claimed that he would rise again. He told his followers directly. He said, "Hey, I know you think that I'm going to lead this big military movement. I'm going to take over the world or something. You guys have to know." He says, "I'm going to die and I'm going to rise from the dead. It's going to be really dope, but you guys got to know I'm going to die. This is the plan." In Acts chapter 2, we read the Apostle Peter gets in front of everybody and he says this was the definite and certain plan of God. He quotes from Psalm 16, where David, about 1,000 years before Christ, said that the Holy One of God would never see corruption. And so there was this belief, even among the Jews at that time who had the Old Testament Torah, there was this belief and knowledge that the Messiah, the rescuer from God, would not die but would live forever. And so it was promised, we read in Luke 24, that Jesus taught them all the prophets spoke, beginning with Moses and all the prophets. In 2 Samuel in the Old Testament, it predicts that there will be a king who would live forever. In the book of Genesis, we read that there would be a king and a scepter from a line that would never end. And so there was this expectation, there was this knowledge that there was some forever king for the people of this world. It was predicted in advance. And so when they got there, and they came to this moment, and they saw the tomb was empty, it was like, hey, we should have been expecting this. But it's hard to expect something like that, right? Because we've all had loss, I'm sure, to one degree or another. We've all had friends and who've passed away, and they don't come back, right? We don't see them just get up. We don't go to the cemetery and lay down the flowers and just go like, maybe today's the day. They're gonna like dig their way out, and so it's hard for us because it's not something that we normally experience. And so even though it was said over and over and over and over again in advance, they were still caught off guard by it, and yet they came to the moment and said, you know what? He told us this was going to happen. He told us this was going to happen. It was predicted in advance. Now think about the audacity to predict something like that. You would have to be a lunatic or just like a liar trying to get money out of people maybe, or to build a following, to build your celebrity, or it would have to be true. I think about the boldest predictions I ever made. I remember one time, it was the first time I ever saw my wife, Katie. She wasn't my wife yet. She was across the room, and I looked to my roommate at the time, and I said, I'm going to meet that girl. And I like telling that story because it sounds like, oh man, but you know what? That's not a very bold prediction. I didn't say like, I'm going to get that girl to fall in love with me. Oh, that girl is going to be mine. We're going to get married. I was like, I'm going to walk up and meet her, and my best case scenario is that she won't go, ew, get away from me now, creep, right? Like the boldest prediction that I could come up with about the future is that I'm going to try to walk over there and hopefully some words will come out. The human capacity to predict the future is very limited. The Bible, over and over again, over the course of thousands of years, and Jesus specifically, repetitively says, I'm going to rise from the dead. Which is, in and of itself, a miracle. And so we could say, well, man, this is just a crazy story. It must be made up. It must be unreliable. It must be lunacy. Which brings us to the second point, that the story is shockingly honest. So you're thinking, okay, if I was going to make up a story, if I was going to fabricate a tale, to build my own legend, to boast in myself, if I was one of Jesus' followers after he died and I somehow wanted to make a name for myself, maybe I could make up a story to make myself look good. You go, maybe the followers after he died, they just wanted him to be something more. But it's crazy, you look at the story, and I gotta tell you, if you were gonna make up a story, they were really bad at it. Because the story is shockingly honest. Even consider the next couple verses in Luke 24. It says, now, it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna the mother, and Mary the mother of James, and other women with them who told all these things to the apostles. But these words seemed to them like an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marveling at what had happened. So there's a couple things here. The leaders of the early church, like including Peter and James and John and other people, the people who would be purported experts in the Christian faith in that early years, none of them believed that Jesus would rise from the dead. In fact, the gospel accounts are filled with them denying Jesus, hiding, running away, pretending like they don't know anything about Jesus. When the resurrection happens, the people who are witnesses to it come and they say, you guys are just making up stories. The very people that Jesus lived with and walked with and told the story to are confronted in the story as having not believed. The people who are responsible for the writing of these early eyewitness accounts are having to be honest, and they're going, yeah, we didn't get it. It's a very embarrassing story to tell about themselves if they're trying to build their own credibility or find some kind of life for themselves after the fact. Not only that, but the first eyewitness testimony is made here by women. And not just any women. Mary Magdalene had had 7 demons cast out of her. Historical knowledge suggests is that she was a sexually immoral woman, and so and we don't really know what that means totally. But here's the thing. Now, the Bible is one of the most empowering books towards women in human history. Okay, and so the Bible tells life like it is and like God intends it to be, and it doesn't do anything to make us feel better about ourselves or to confirm our own prejudices, but it confronts us with the way that God sees the world. And in those days, the eyewitness testimony of a woman was not admissible in court, that's a whole other conversation because that's disgusting. But so the eyewitness testimony of women was not admissible in court. And so this eyewitness testimony that we're given in the Bible is written in a way that it would have been worthless to convince any of the religious leaders or political leaders or people of repute in that society. And God says, yeah, but it was the women who believed me. And so God tells the story about these women and how it was just thought that they were telling idle tales, and yet it was the true story. It's the Bible, once again, confronting our prejudices, confronting our views of the world, confronting the story that we would tell if we were making up a story to make it believable, tells it its own way and says, this is what God did. Not only that, but in another section, there's a part about how they spread the story that the body was stolen. Now this is really interesting because in those days, if you were tasked to be a bodyguard and or a guard of any kind, and whatever you were guarding got stolen, you would be killed and receive capital punishment for having lost what you were to guard. So your job was to give your life to guard something. And so we read the story that the story was spread that the guards had allowed the body to be stolen. Well, now, if that's a true story that the body was stolen, that story never would have been spread, because anybody who shared the story would have been killed for the story being found out. They would have received capital punishment. And so there never would have been an instance, there never would have been a case in which the story of a stolen body was spread throughout the community, because that would be impractical and unlikely. And so we see here that the Bible just tells a shockingly honest story. That it tells of miraculous things, but it tells of everyday things that just can't help but be the way it was, because if you were going to make it up, you would have told it a different way. You would have said it in a way that the disciples looked really great because they're the ones leading this new church. And you would have told it in a way that you had, look at the credentials on these people who are our main eyewitnesses. And you would have had a story that made sense in that community at that time. Which leads us to the next point. So not only was it predicted in advance, not only is it shockingly honest, but third, we have reliable eyewitness accounts. Later here in what we read from Luke, Jesus is alive and he's walking with some disciples and he pretends like he doesn't know what's going on. And they say, are you the only one in all of Jerusalem who doesn't know what's happening? You see, this was a public event. When people were crucified in the Roman Empire, they were crucified publicly. They were crucified publicly to make an example. So it was like in front of, you go out in front of the grove and we just line up all the crucifixes so that everybody's afraid and nobody steals from the grove. That's how it went down. That they killed everybody, executed them publicly, and it was a vicious dictatorship. And so this is how it went down. And so everybody knew that this folk hero, this religious leader who collected crowds of tens of thousands of people all around the country, that he was in front of everybody. It was really clear that the empire at the time said, we don't want this guy around, and they got rid of him. And so everybody knew about this Jesus guy. And so it wasn't possible, it wasn't practical to just start spreading stories around, because all of the people who had witnessed the events were there. And you know what's great? You see, sometimes people might say, well, the Bible doesn't have contradictions in it and things like that, and people tell different stories. And I read about the resurrection in Luke, and it sounded one way, and I read about the resurrection in Matthew, and it sounded another way. How can we trust these stories? But you know what's great is the gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They all share a different perspective on the same events. And so by giving us these different perspectives, we get a reliable, full eyewitness picture of what happened. Have you ever seen an accident? You were like driving through and somebody ran a red light and all of a sudden a car hit and they were spinning, and then you've been asked to like give a statement to the police. Maybe you've never had to do this or you've heard of it. It's the kind of thing you can never forget, right? But over time you start thinking, what are these details? But what happens is right away, immediately they try to get you a statement to get it accurate. And you know what they found? A couple things. One, that eyewitness testimony tends to be very reliable, but also think about an intersection, how you have people from all four different directions. People are going to see different things, right? So you're coming from the south, and you may see the cars coming, and you see the moment of impact. And so that just like consumes your thoughts. When you're giving the statements, you're giving all the statements about the moment of impact. But let's say you're a pedestrian standing over here. You may be looking from the other side of the car, and you may not see the moment of impact and exactly where it hit. But you're going to notice, because you're from a different perspective, you're going to notice that you were scared that somebody was going to roll and hit you. And you're going to look this way, and you're going to notice that there was another pedestrian, and they could have got hit. And so you're going to tell a version of the story that's the exact same event, but you're going to notice a person on the other side who you thought was in danger that the person sitting in their car couldn't see. And then you might have somebody on the other side, right? And they see the impact. And they are the ones who get out of the car and go open the door, and they pull the baby out of the inside, right? And so they've got this story because they know who was in the vehicle and what happened and when the paramedics showed up. And so everybody sees the same event from a different perspective. What happens is you begin to be able to put a collage together of the full picture and of the full story. And so the person who just says, man, I saw the impact, is their story wrong? No, it's absolutely true, but they're just showing you that one perspective. And the person who says, oh yeah, I saw the pedestrians in danger, is their story a lie because it doesn't talk about no, it's true, but they're just giving you this piece of the evidence. And the person who talks about the ambulance showing up and pulling the people out of the car, they're giving you a piece of the story. And so we have that with the resurrection accounts, where we have multitudes of perspectives and eyewitnesses' accounts of different appearances and different people showing up at the tomb, and different people sharing a meal with him, and different people seeing him give a speech, and different people talking about how they showed up and they heard these people talking about it. And what begins to happen is you begin to build this unassailable case. All of these accounts that add up to show different parts but tell the one same story, where they're going, okay, we saw him hanging on the cross, we saw the spear in his side, we saw him pronounced dead at the scene, and then we saw him again. And we saw him again. Paul, the Apostle Paul, writes this in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And Paul says, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Paul, writing to a church in Greece, hundreds of miles away from where these events took place in Jerusalem, says, look, he's going to go on later and say, look, if Jesus doesn't rise from the dead, this is all kind of a waste of time. But he says, but this guy saw him, and that guy saw him, and that guy saw him, and I saw him, and 500 people saw him at once, and they're all alive, and you can go talk to him. And all the people who were in that church, who read that letter, who knew those other people, said, yeah, this happened. This happened. And that's how the movement began. It happened from what we read in Luke of people saying, Jesus being around, walking for 40 days and saying, hey, you can touch me. You can see the scars of where I was nailed to the cross. You You can touch me. You think I'm just like a ghost? You're imagining me? Here, let's eat some fish. Where'd the fish go if I'm not real? And this happened to the point where people were going, you know what? This doesn't really fit into the way I understand the world. This doesn't usually happen. This is not what I was expecting. I look a little foolish now that this is the case, but I can't help but admit that this guy Jesus rose from the dead because everybody is seeing it. And I'm thinking, maybe did I do something wrong? Did I eat something weird last night? But I asked this guy and he said the same thing. Which leads to point number 4. So why we really need to consider this is that the life changes. The life changes are remarkable. The resurrection of Jesus turned the entire world upside down. We mentioned Peter. He denied Christ 3 times publicly. He went into hiding. He didn't believe the stories at first, but he went and checked for himself. And then, 50 days later, he gets up in front of thousands of people, the people that he's afraid can kill him because he is an outlaw for following somebody who was a leader that was outlawed in the Roman government. He gets up in front of this huge crowd, and he points at the crowd, and he says, "You allowed Jesus to die. And I did too. But God told us he would rise from the dead, and he did. And I command you to turn from your life and follow Jesus." And with boldness and with hope and with clarity, he got up and he said, "Let's follow this Jesus." And thousands of these witnesses who understood what he was saying, had seen what he was saying, immediately in a day began and formed the first Christian church in Jerusalem. And John, the Apostle John, he was known as one of the sons of thunder, which was a nickname that meant he had an anger problem. And he had relationships and ins and was buddy-buddy with some of the elite ruling class so that he was able to get inside access to the trial of Jesus. He was able to be there and witness these things because he was in good with the people who put Jesus to death. And this man, known for his intemperance and his volatility, is known in history as the apostle of love. Because he was so moved by what he saw and by what he experienced in his life with Jesus that it totally changed him from the inside out. And he began to live his life in such a way and to do writings and spend time with people in such a way that he would mentor people and care for people and love people unconditionally and talk about sacrificing your life for people. And Peter, who believed in the message so much that he allowed himself to be crucified upside down, John was exiled. Actually, they tried to boil him alive, and he was put on an island for the rest of his days until he was very old. Never stopped showing grace and love, helping the churches of God and the people around the world. Or even Paul. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, "I persecuted the church of God." He goes, "I didn't think this story was real," and so he said, "I tried to put Christians to death." Paul was on the council that put Jesus to death. We don't know if he was there at that meeting, but what we know about him is that he would have in a second voted to put Jesus to death. But he has an interaction with the risen Jesus that fundamentally changed his life, and he becomes the starter of churches. He becomes imprisoned for the cause. He becomes crucified, killed for the cause. He spends his entire life talking about Jesus, planting churches, helping people to follow God. By AD 300, it was the official religion of the Roman Empire that put all these people to death. Now, we can talk about the implications of that and whether that was a good thing or not. But it was an undeniable force of nature because person after person after person said, "There's something here." And it began changing them from the inside out. Something happened. You can call it lunacy, you can hate it, but you can't argue that something has changed the world, something we have to reckon with. And it has the power to change a life. In John 10, Jesus says, "I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly." See, Jesus died and rose again, and in doing that, he proved that he had power over life, physical life and spiritual life, to show us that he was the one who could give life. And to us, a people wandering in a sometimes very difficult world, he says, I've come to give you life. He changes our lives. That's my story. I didn't grow up going to church or believing any of this stuff. I was the one going, yeah, but what about this, and what about that, and what about, well, science and history, and I read this other book, and people I care about, they don't believe this stuff. But something happened. Something happened bigger than a history lesson. I met Jesus. I don't mean that I met him in like a physical way. I mean that when I encountered him, there was something supernatural, there was something spiritual in a relationship that began. And whereas I had been angry and depressed, and I had destructive habits and broken relationships, and there was these good things I wanted to do in my life, and I was always finding myself unable to do them, and there was these bad things in my life that I didn't like about myself, but I couldn't help but be controlled by them, and I was going around wandering through life, and when Jesus entered in my life, he changed me. And I don't mean that now I have it all together and I'm some guru and I've got all the answers and look at me, I'm perfect, but something happened where I began to experience life. And Jesus was no longer just somebody I had heard about, he was somebody I knew. And in a quiet moment of brokenness, I could pray. And there was this, what the Bible calls a peace that surpasses understanding. There was these moments where I could pour my heart out to him, and he really heard me. And there was these times where I needed the strength to change, and I tried before, and I tried all kinds of different methods, and I tried to just pull myself up by the bootstraps, and it never worked. But then all of a sudden, there was this power, there was this difference that I was alive. And Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but he has passed from death to life. He didn't say you will pass from death to life. Although that's true, the Bible promises that when we die, we get to experience eternal life with him. No, he says you have passed from death to life. That you can experience a life-giving, life-transforming relationship with Jesus right now. Which leads to the final point. The resurrection story, that can be your story. The story of life from the dead. Reviving who you were truly made to be. Experiencing fullness and abundance, hope and joy, peace and mercy. That can be your story. That the God who's able to revive physically from the grave can do even more than that in your life. John 11, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. And then he asks the person this question. Do you believe this? See, everything in Christianity, and I think for this whole world, rises and falls on this question. Either it was a sham, or it was the honest-to-God truth that Jesus said he would rise from the dead, and then he did. And in doing so, he proved that he was God, that he had power to give us life, that he had the power to rewrite the endings of our stories, that he could give us hope and a future. And he said, I've come to enter your story. I'm here for you. do you believe this? Let's pray. Father God, I confess that sometimes I only believe what's right in front of me. And I get caught up in the day-to-day of so many things in this world. But God, you have shown yourself to be real. You've shown yourself to be God. You've shown yourself to have power over the grave, over our spiritual poverty and death. And God, would you give us life? Lord, I pray for those now who are wondering, is this for me? Do I believe this? God, that you would show yourself in a real and mighty way. That you would enter our stories and our lives. That you would start something big today in our community. That you would do something bigger than all the parties. That you would do something bigger than what you've done before. That you would show up in a way that's undeniable like you've done so many times. Lord, thank you for your love and your power. And I say this in Jesus' name, and God's people say, amen.